In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, where tree-lined streets and manicured lawns gave the illusion of perfection, life seemed predictable, until one sunny afternoon when everything changed. The air was warm, and the sound of birds chirping filled the silence as two children laughed while running around their front yard. They were ordinary kids doing what most children love, playing outside. Their names were Emily, who was 10, and her younger brother Jake, who was 8. To anyone passing by, they looked like any other siblings enjoying a carefree moment after school. But not everyone saw it that way. Across the street, Mrs. Harper sat at her living room window, sipping tea and watching the world go by, or more accurately, keeping tabs on her neighbors. She fancied herself the unofficial watchdog of the block, always ready to point out anything she deemed improper or out of place. That day, her sharp eyes landed on Emily and Jake. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but then it hit her. They were alone. No adult hovered nearby. No watchful parent stood guard. In Mrs. Harper's mind, this wasn't just careless. It was downright dangerous. Mrs. Harper had always been particular about how things should be done in the neighborhood. Her own grandchildren lived far away, and she often found herself comparing every family she encountered to some idealized version of perfection she'd imagined. To her, letting children play unsupervised was practically criminal. Shaking her head disapprovingly, she muttered under her breath, "These parents need to do better." Without wasting another moment, she picked up the phone and dialed Child Protective Services, CPS. Her call was calm but firm. "I'm reporting neglect," she said confidently, explaining that two children were playing outside without supervision. She described them as roaming freely and expressed concern for their safety. The operator on the other end assured her that someone would look into the matter promptly. Satisfied with herself, Mrs. Harper hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, convinced she'd done the right thing. After all, wasn't it her duty to protect the community? What Mrs. Harper didn't know, however, was that her actions would set off a chain reaction far beyond what she could have anticipated. On the surface, her complaint seemed justified. After all, shouldn't parents be present when their kids are outside? But what she failed to consider were the unseen struggles behind closed doors. She couldn't see the sacrifices being made inside that modest house across the street. She didn't know about the late nights spent working to make ends meet, or the quiet determination of a mother trying to give her children a sense of normalcy despite immense loss. And she certainly didn't realize that her decision to call CPS would lead to a discovery so profound that it would challenge not only her assumptions, but also those of everyone else in the neighborhood. As Mrs. Harper settled back into her routine, unaware of the storm brewing, the wheels of investigation began turning. Within hours, a CPS officer would arrive on the scene, ready to assess the situation. Little did anyone know, this seemingly simple act of reporting neglect would uncover layers of complexity and ultimately transform the entire community in ways no one could have predicted. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up to the curb. Detective Laura Klein stepped out, her presence calm but authoritative. She had been in this line of work long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving. Some cases were cut and dry, clear signs of neglect or harm, but others required a deeper look, a willingness to dig beneath the surface. As she approached the modest house where the children were playing, her eyes scanned the scene carefully. Emily and Jake were still running around the front yard, their laughter echoing through the air. They seemed completely at ease, chasing each other with boundless energy. Detective Klein couldn't help but notice how happy they appeared. There was no fear in their expressions, no hint of distress. In fact, they looked like any other kids enjoying a typical afternoon outdoors. Still, protocol demanded an investigation, and she wasn't about to jump to conclusions without gathering all the facts. As she walked closer, Emily spotted her first. The young girl slowed down, curiosity lighting up her face. "Who are you?" she asked innocently, tilting her head to one side. Detective Klein smiled warmly, crouching slightly to meet the child's gaze. "I'm here to talk to your mom," she explained gently. "Is she home?" Emily nodded enthusiastically and turned toward the house, calling out for her mother. Moments later, the front door opened, and Sarah Thompson appeared. Sarah looked surprised but not alarmed. She greeted Detective Klein politely, inviting her inside while keeping a watchful eye on the kids outside. Laura noted how composed Sarah seemed, despite the unexpected visit. It wasn't uncommon for parents to feel defensive or anxious when CPS showed up, but Sarah exuded a quiet confidence. Something about her demeanor struck Laura as genuine, a woman doing her best under challenging circumstances. While waiting for Sarah to settle into the living room, Laura took another glance outside. Through the window, she could see Emily and Jake continuing their game, oblivious to the seriousness of the situation unfolding indoors. Their movements were fluid, natural, and full of joy. Laura found herself wondering what kind of environment fostered such contentment. Was it possible that these children were thriving despite, or perhaps because of, their independence? Back inside, Sarah offered Laura a seat and began answering questions calmly. She explained that she worked from home, managing freelance projects to support her family. Her workspace was just steps away from the front door, allowing her to keep an eye on the kids through the window. "I trust them to play safely," she said softly, her voice tinged with both pride and vulnerability. "They've learned to take care of each other." Laura listened intently, her instincts telling her there was more to this story than met the eye. The complaint had painted a picture of neglect, but what she saw before her, a loving mother and two vibrant, well-adjusted children, didn't align with that narrative. Something felt off, and Laura knew she needed to dig deeper. For now, though, she kept her questions focused and her tone reassuring, determined to uncover the truth without causing unnecessary alarm. Outside, the sun continued to shine brightly, casting golden light over the yard, where Emily and Jake played. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like an ordinary day in the neighborhood. But inside the house, the wheels of discovery were beginning to turn. Little did anyone know, this case would reveal far more than whether a parent had made a poor choice. It would expose the complexities of life, resilience, and the power of community. And as Detective Klein prepared to delve further into the details, she couldn't shake the feeling that this investigation would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. Detective Laura Klein returned to Sarah's home later that afternoon, her thoughts swirling with the discoveries she'd made. As she stepped inside, she noticed Emily and Jake sitting at the kitchen table, their heads bent over a shared coloring book. The scene was peaceful, almost idyllic. Two siblings working together, their giggles filling the air. Sarah stood nearby, stirring something on the stove, her movements calm but deliberate. Laura watched for a moment, struck by the quiet harmony of the household. It was clear these children weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Sitting down with Sarah once more, Laura decided to dig even deeper into the dynamics of the family. She asked about the kids' routines, their personalities, and how they handled challenges. Sarah lit up as she spoke, her voice brimming with pride. "Emily has always been protective of Jake," she explained. "Ever since Mark passed, she's taken it upon herself to look out for him. She reminds him to drink water when he's playing outside, helps him tie his shoes if I'm busy. It's like having a little helper." Laura nodded, recalling the chore chart she'd seen earlier. "And Jake?" she asked. Sarah smiled fondly. "He's the cheerful one. He loves making people laugh, and he adores his sister. They bicker sometimes, sure, but they always stick together. I think losing their dad brought them closer in ways I couldn't have imagined." As they talked, Laura pieced together a fuller picture of the family's resilience. These weren't ordinary kids. They were young souls who had faced loss and hardship, yet continued to find joy in the everyday moments. Their bond wasn't just sibling affection. It was a partnership forged through love and necessity. And Sarah, despite her own struggles, had nurtured that connection beautifully. But there was more to uncover. Laura gently probed about Mark's influence on the family. Sarah's eyes softened as she described her late husband. "He believed in giving kids room to grow," she said. "He used to say, if we hover too much, they'll never learn to fly." He encouraged me to let them explore, make mistakes, and figure things out for themselves. After he was gone, I promised myself I'd keep doing that, for him and for them. Hearing this, Laura felt a lump rise in her throat. Here was a mother honoring her husband's memory not through words but through action. She wasn't perfect. No parent was. But she was doing her best to raise strong, independent children who would carry forward the values Mark had instilled. It was a remarkable legacy, one that deserved recognition rather than suspicion. The final revelation came when Laura asked about the community. Did Sarah feel supported by her neighbors? Her answer was telling. "Not really," she admitted quietly. "I think some people judge us because we don't fit their idea of a perfect family. But we're doing okay. We have each other, and that's enough." Those last words lingered in Laura's mind long after she left the house. They encapsulated everything she'd observed. A family that might not have all the material comforts or societal approval, but was rich in love, trust, and determination. What Mrs. Harper, and perhaps others in the neighborhood, had mistaken for neglect was actually a profound act of faith. Sarah trusted her children to navigate the world safely, to lean on each other, and to grow into capable individuals. That kind of parenting didn't come from laziness or carelessness. It came from strength. As evening fell, Laura sat in her car, jotting notes about the case. She realized this wasn't just about proving Sarah was a good mother. It was about challenging outdated notions of what parenting should look like. Independence wasn't abandonment. It was empowerment. Trust wasn't negligence. It was confidence. And resilience wasn't weakness. It was courage. With newfound clarity, Laura knew exactly what she needed to do next. This story wasn't hers alone to tell. It belonged to the entire community. If they could see past their biases and judgments, they might just discover the beauty in Sarah's approach. And maybe, just maybe, they'd begin to understand that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is step back and let their children shine. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, as it always did in such tight-knit communities. By the next morning, whispers about Sarah and her children had made their way from one porch to another. People who had once glanced disapprovingly at Emily and Jake playing outside now found themselves questioning what they thought they knew. Mrs. Harper's apology to Sarah, a quiet but sincere gesture, had opened a door that many hadn't realized was closed. And soon, curiosity turned into action. Mrs. Harper wasn't the only neighbor who reached out. Other residents began stopping by Sarah's house, some with baked goods, others offering help with errands or babysitting. At first, Sarah was taken aback by the sudden wave of kindness. She had grown accustomed to keeping to herself, focusing on her children and work without expecting much from those around her. But as more neighbors extended their hands, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: a sense of belonging. One afternoon, Laura Klein drove past the Thompson home and noticed a group of women gathered in the driveway. They were chatting animatedly while Emily and Jake played nearby, their laughter mingling with a hum of conversation. Sarah stood among them, smiling as she balanced a plate of cookies in one hand and a glass of lemonade in the other. It was a scene so different from the isolation she'd endured for months, and Laura couldn't help but feel proud of the role she'd played in bringing this transformation about. But the change didn't stop there. The ripple effect of the investigation reached far beyond Sarah's front yard. Neighbors started reevaluating their own assumptions, not just about parenting, but about community itself. Conversations shifted from gossip to genuine interest. Parents began discussing the benefits of giving their own children more freedom, inspired by what they'd learned about Emily and Jake. Even local schools took note, hosting workshops on fostering independence and resilience in kids. The most surprising turn came when Mrs. Harper invited Sarah and her children over for dinner. It was an olive branch extended not out of obligation, but out of a desire to truly understand. Over steaming plates of lasagna and garlic bread, The two women talked openly about their lives, their challenges, their values, and their hopes for the future. For the first time, Mrs. Harper saw Sarah not as a stranger raising her children differently, but as a fellow human navigating life's complexities with grace and determination. As weeks passed, the neighborhood transformed in subtle yet profound ways. Playdates became more common, with groups of children running between yards under the watchful eyes of multiple parents. Front porches buzzed with laughter and shared stories instead of judgmental glances. Sarah even joined a local support group for single parents, finding solace and friendship in people who understood her journey. Detective Laura Klein watched these changes unfold with quiet satisfaction. Her initial investigation had uncovered more than just the truth about one family. It had revealed the power of empathy to bridge divides. What started as a complaint rooted in bias had ended in unity, proving that even the smallest acts of understanding could spark meaningful change. In the end, everyone learned something valuable. Sarah discovered that she didn't have to face life's hardships alone, that leaning on others wasn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. Mrs. Harper realized that differences weren't threats. They were opportunities to grow and connect. And the rest of the neighborhood came to understand that true community wasn't built on perfection or uniformity, but on compassion, trust, and a willingness to embrace imperfection. On a crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, the entire street came together for a potluck dinner. Tables lined the cul-de-sac, laden with dishes contributed by every household. Children darted between chairs, chasing each other with gleeful shouts, while adults laughed and shared stories late into the night. Amidst the warmth and camaraderie, Sarah looked around at the faces of her neighbors and smiled. Life hadn't become easier overnight, but it had become richer, fuller, and infinitely more hopeful. And as Detective Laura Klein drove past one last time, she couldn't help but think, sometimes, the smallest investigations lead to the biggest transformations. The following day, Detective Laura Klein decided it was time to bring the story full circle. She knew that resolving this case wasn't just about closing a file or clearing Sarah's name. It was about fostering understanding within the neighborhood. Change couldn't happen in isolation. It required collective effort. So, armed with her findings and a renewed sense of purpose, she made one final visit to Mrs. Harper. When Laura arrived, Mrs. Harper greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The previous conversation had clearly left its mark, as the older woman seemed more subdued than usual. Laura didn't waste time on formalities. Instead, she launched into an explanation of what she'd uncovered during her investigation, not to scold Mrs. Harper, but to educate her. "Mrs. Harper," Laura began gently, "I want to share something important with you. When I first came here, I thought your concerns were valid. After all, keeping children safe is everyone's priority. But as I dug deeper, I realized there's so much more to this story than meets the eye." She went on to describe Sarah's life, the loss of her husband, the financial struggles, and the incredible strength she showed in raising two happy, well-adjusted children despite the odds. "These kids aren't neglected," Laura emphasized. "They're learning valuable lessons every day. How to take care of each other, how to solve problems, and how to be independent. Their mom trusts them because she's taught them well." Mrs. Harper listened intently, her expression softening as Laura spoke. For the first time, she seemed genuinely interested rather than defensive. Sensing an opening, Laura shared examples from history and research. "Did you know that studies show unstructured outdoor play helps children develop critical thinking skills and emotional resilience?" she asked. "Of course, safety is essential, but constant supervision isn't always necessary, or even beneficial. Kids need space to explore and grow." Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted quietly. "I guess I'd always believed there's only one right way to raise children. Maybe I was too quick to judge." Laura nodded, sensing the shift in tone. "It's easy to make assumptions when we don't know the whole story," she said kindly. "But sometimes, taking a step back and asking questions can change our perspective." Sarah isn't doing anything wrong. She's simply parenting in a way that works for her family. To drive her point home, Laura recounted specific moments from her visits. Emily reminding Jake to stay hydrated, the chore chart filled with check marks, the laughter echoing through the house. These are signs of a loving, functional home, she explained. Not everything fits into a neat box, and that's okay. What matters most is that these kids feel safe, loved, and supported. And they do. By the end of the conversation, Mrs. Harper looked visibly humbled. Her earlier certainty had melted away, replaced by a quiet reflection. "I suppose I should have talked to Sarah before calling CPS," she murmured. "Maybe I jumped to conclusions." "You acted out of concern," Laura reassured her. "And while your intentions were good, this experience shows us how important it is to approach situations like this with empathy and understanding. Sometimes, reaching out directly can make all the difference." As Laura prepared to leave, Mrs. Harper stopped her at the door. "Detective Klein," she said hesitantly, "do you think Sarah would mind if I apologized, or maybe introduced myself properly?" Laura smiled warmly. "I think she'd appreciate that very much," she replied. "Why don't you give it a try? You might be surprised by how much you have in common." Driving away, Laura felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. This case had started with suspicion and misunderstanding, but it was ending with the possibility of connection. By turning the tables and using the investigation as an opportunity to educate, she had planted seeds of change, not just in Mrs. Harper, but potentially in the entire neighborhood. What happened next was out of her hands, but she was confident that compassion would win out. After all, communities weren't built on judgment. They were strengthened by kindness, open hearts, and a willingness to see beyond appearances. Detective Laura Klein sat across from Sarah Thompson in the small but cozy living room. The space was simple, yet it carried a warmth that couldn't be ignored. A faded couch with mismatched throw pillows sat against one wall, and a handmade quilt was draped over the armrest. On the coffee table lay a stack of papers, bills, school notices, and grocery lists, neatly organized despite their clutter. Above the fireplace hung a family photo, Sarah smiling brightly alongside her husband, who stood proudly with his arm around her shoulders, while Emily and Jake grinned happily in front of them. But something about the picture caught Laura's attention. It was clearly taken years ago, judging by the children's younger faces. As they spoke, Sarah revealed more about her life. She explained that her husband, Mark, had passed away unexpectedly 2 years earlier. His death had left a void not only in their hearts but also in their daily routines. "He was my partner in everything," Sarah said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "We always dreamed of giving our kids a happy childhood, full of adventures and freedom. After he was gone, well, I promised myself I wouldn't let his absence rob them of that." Laura listened intently, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she absorbed the weight of Sarah's story. It wasn't hard to see how much effort Sarah put into keeping her family afloat. She worked long hours from home, juggling client deadlines while ensuring her children felt loved and supported. "I can't always be outside with them," Sarah admitted, glancing toward the window where Emily and Jake were still playing. "But I make sure they're safe. They know the rules. We've talked about staying close to home, looking out for cars, and sticking together." What struck Laura most was the balance Sarah had created between trust and responsibility. She didn't hover over her kids, but she hadn't abandoned them either. Instead, she had instilled in them a sense of independence, a skill many parents might overlook in favor of constant supervision. As Sarah spoke, Laura noticed the pride in her voice when she mentioned how Emily looked out for Jake, reminding him to drink water or helping him tie his shoelaces if needed. These small acts of kindness showed maturity and teamwork, qualities that spoke volumes about the kind of environment Sarah had nurtured. The conversation shifted briefly to finances. Sarah confessed that money had been tight since Mark's passing. Freelance work wasn't always consistent, and there were months when bills piled up faster than she could pay them. Yet, she refused to let financial stress overshadow her children's happiness. "They've already lost so much," she said firmly. "I won't let them lose their childhood too." Her determination was palpable, and Laura found herself admiring the resilience this woman had shown in the face of adversity. Despite the challenges, the house itself reflected care and intentionality. Hand-drawn pictures decorated the refrigerator, each one labeled with cheerful notes like "Best Mom Ever" or "Love You, Mommy." A chore chart hung on the kitchen wall, its rows filled with check marks indicating completed tasks. Even the worn patches on the furniture seemed less like signs of neglect and more like evidence of a family making the best of what they had. As the discussion continued, Laura began piecing together a clearer picture of Sarah's world. This wasn't a case of neglect. It was a portrait of perseverance. Here was a mother doing everything in her power to provide stability and joy for her children, even when life threw curveballs her way. While the initial complaint had painted a grim scenario, Laura couldn't ignore the reality unfolding before her eyes. Something about this family resonated deeply, a quiet strength that defied easy judgment. Before leaving, Laura thanked Sarah for her time, promising to follow up soon. As she stepped back outside, she glanced once more at Emily and Jake, now sitting beneath a tree sketching pictures in the dirt with sticks. Their laughter rang out again, pure and unguarded. For a moment, Laura allowed herself to imagine what it must feel like to grow up in such a household, not perfect, but brimming with love and resilience. And though the investigation was far from over, one thing was becoming clear: appearances could be deceiving, and sometimes the truth lay hidden beneath layers of misunderstanding. Detective Laura Klein returned to Mrs. Harper's house the next morning, her mind clear and her purpose firm. She wasn't there to argue or accuse, but to open a dialogue, one that might challenge the assumptions behind the complaint. Mrs. Harper answered the door with a polite smile, though her posture stiffened slightly as she invited Laura inside. The living room was immaculate, every cushion perfectly fluffed, every surface polished to a shine. It was the kind of home that screamed order and control, a stark contrast to Sarah's warm yet lived-in space. As they sat down, Laura began by thanking Mrs. Harper for bringing the situation to CPS's attention. "We always appreciate when neighbors look out for each other," she said kindly, softening the tone of the conversation before diving deeper. But instead of focusing on Sarah's parenting choices right away, Laura asked Mrs. Harper to share more about her own perspective. Why did she feel so strongly about children playing outside without direct supervision? At first, Mrs. Harper hesitated, perhaps sensing where this line of questioning was headed. But then she launched into a passionate explanation, her words flowing faster as she spoke. "In my day, kids didn't just run wild like that," she said firmly. "Parents kept a close eye on their children. It's dangerous out there. Cars speeding, strangers lurking. How can anyone think it's safe to let them roam free?" Laura nodded thoughtfully, letting Mrs. Harper vent her frustrations. When the older woman paused, Laura gently interjected. "I understand your concerns," she said. "Safety is important, and no one wants to see children in harm's way. But have you ever considered that different families approach parenting in different ways? Some parents believe in giving their kids a bit more freedom because it helps them learn responsibility and problem solving." Mrs. Harper frowned, clearly skeptical. "Responsibility?" she echoed. "How is leaving them alone responsible? They're just children. They don't know any better." This was the moment Laura had been waiting for, the opportunity to shift the narrative. "Actually," she replied calmly, "research shows that unstructured play, especially outdoors, can be incredibly beneficial for children. It encourages creativity, builds confidence, and teaches them how to navigate the world safely. Of course, there are limits, but complete oversight isn't always necessary, or even healthy." She went on to explain that Emily and Jake weren't truly unsupervised. Their mother worked nearby and kept tabs on them through the window. More importantly, the siblings looked out for each other, demonstrating maturity and teamwork. Laura shared examples from her investigation. the chore chart, the organized home, the happy demeanor of the children. From what I've seen, she concluded, these kids are thriving. Their mom has created an environment where they feel trusted and capable. Mrs. Harper listened silently, her expression shifting between skepticism and contemplation. For the first time, doubt crept into her rigid beliefs. Laura pressed gently, asking if she'd ever spoken directly with Sarah about her concerns. Sometimes misunderstandings happen, Laura suggested. Maybe talking openly could help clarify things. Mrs. Harper shook her head, admitting she hadn't approached Sarah. I didn't want to interfere, she muttered, but someone had to step in. Laura smiled warmly. It's good to care about your community, she acknowledged. But stepping in doesn't always mean making a call. Sometimes it means reaching out, getting to know people, understanding their circumstances. You might find that what looks unusual at first glance makes perfect sense once you hear the whole story. The conversation ended on a reflective note. As Laura left, she noticed a subtle change in Mrs. Harper's demeanor. The defensive edge had softened, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. Perhaps the seeds of empathy had been planted, however small, and while Laura knew changing deeply ingrained opinions wouldn't happen overnight, she felt hopeful that this encounter might inspire Mrs. Harper and others to reconsider their judgments. Driving away, Laura couldn't help but think about the ripple effect of this case. What started as a simple complaint had unveiled layers of complexity: grief, resilience, trust, and bias. Now, it was up to the community to decide how they would respond, not with criticism, but with compassion. Detective Laura Klein's mind raced as she left Sarah's home. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but something still tugged at her instincts, urging her to dig deeper. She decided to take a closer look at the household, not just the people, but the environment itself. It was often in the details that the true story revealed itself, and Laura had learned over the years that even the smallest clues could speak volumes. Walking back inside, she asked Sarah if she could take a quick tour of the house. Sarah nodded, though a flicker of nervousness crossed her face. Of course, she said, leading Laura down a narrow hallway. The first room they entered was the kitchen. It wasn't large, but it was tidy. Dishes were stacked neatly on the drying rack, and the countertops gleamed despite their age. A jar of colorful markers sat next to a pile of construction paper, evidence of recent craft projects. On the table, Laura noticed a handwritten grocery list with items carefully prioritized, staples like bread, milk, and eggs marked with stars, while luxuries like cookies were scribbled at the bottom. Next, they moved to the children's bedroom. 2 twin beds stood side by side, each adorned with mismatched but clean sheets. Emily's bed was neatly made, while Jake's had a slight rumple, his stuffed dinosaur lying haphazardly at the foot. Posters of animals and superheroes covered the walls, and shelves held books, puzzles, and toys, all arranged with care. What caught Laura's eye most, however, was the chore chart pinned to the wall. Each day's tasks were listed in bright colors. Make beds, feed cat, set table. Both Emily and Jake had diligently checked off their responsibilities for the week. It was clear these kids weren't just playing outside unsupervised. They were actively contributing to the household. The final stop was Sarah's workspace, tucked into a corner of the living room. A laptop rested on a folding table, surrounded by notebooks and folders. Sticky notes covered the wall above it, filled with reminders about deadlines, appointments, and even encouraging messages like, "You've got this." Nearby, a bulletin board displayed family photos alongside school schedules and doctor's appointment cards. Everything had its place, no matter how modest or makeshift. This wasn't a home of chaos or neglect. It was a home of careful organization, born out of necessity and love. As Laura observed these details, she couldn't help but contrast them with Mrs. Harper's complaint. Where the neighbor saw danger, Laura saw resourcefulness. Where Mrs. Harper saw abandonment, Laura saw trust. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this case wasn't about neglect at all. But there was still one person whose perspective needed examination: Mrs. Harper herself. Later that afternoon, Laura paid a visit to the woman who had made the call. Mrs. Harper greeted her with an air of self-assurance, offering tea as though she expected praise for her civic duty. Laura accepted politely, using the opportunity to ask questions. Why had she felt compelled to report Sarah? What exactly had troubled her about the children playing outside? At first, Mrs. Harper stuck to her original stance, insisting that unsupervised play was reckless and unsafe. But as Laura probed further, subtle hints of bias began to surface. Mrs. Harper admitted she preferred stricter parenting styles, ones where children were constantly monitored. She lamented the freedom modern kids enjoyed, claiming it led to unruly behavior. When Laura gently pointed out that independence could foster responsibility, Mrs. Harper bristled. "It's not my job to raise other people's children," she snapped, though her tone suggested otherwise. Beneath her words lay traces of resentment, not necessarily toward Sarah, but perhaps toward the idea that someone else might do things differently than she would. By the time Laura left Mrs. Harper's house, her suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't a case of genuine concern for the children's welfare. It was rooted in personal judgment and outdated beliefs. Mrs. Harper's actions stemmed less from malice and more from a lack of understanding, or perhaps even envy. After all, here was a single mother raising two happy, well-adjusted children despite unimaginable loss. Maybe that reality challenged Mrs. Harper's own ideals, prompting her to label it as wrong rather than admirable. Back in her car, Laura reflected on what she'd uncovered so far. The contrast between the two women couldn't have been starker. One lived by rules and rigidity, while the other embraced flexibility and trust. Yet both cared deeply, albeit in vastly different ways. As Laura drove away, she realized this investigation wasn't just about determining whether neglect had occurred. It was about bridging the gap between perception and reality, judgment and empathy. And somewhere in the middle lay the truth, waiting to be shared.